Coming up on Capital Crossfire, our student panelists discuss current issues such as the recently drafted Student Loan Relief Plan, as well as gun control regulation in the wake of another mass shooting in the U.S.
Joining us today for our discussion, Eyad Sleem, Dan Saleem, Liz Stoddard, moderated by Carter Ohline.
I'm Nina.
And I'm Nicholas.
From the GW-TV studios in Washington, D.C.
This is Capital Crossfire. President Joe Biden recently announced a drafted plan to provide student loan relief. The plan differs slightly from his previous proposal, including a narrower pool of eligible Americans with only selected groups eligible to receive relief from the proposal.
It aims to contain policies that would promise one-time debt relief, as well as relief systems through multiple installments. The U.S. Department of Education will gather a panel of higher education experts to finalize this proposal. The president declared that his administration is working to provide debt relief for as many people as possible.
On Wednesday, October 25th, a shooting occurred in Lewiston, Maine, tragically leaving 18 people dead. This event caused citizens of Lewiston to push their representative, Jared Golden, to fight for the passing of an assault weapons ban.
Today, to debate, we have Eyad Sleem, Dan Saleem, and Liz Stoddard.
On the left, Liz Stoddard, a first-year majoring in political science. She is a legislative assistant for the GW Student Association.
In the middle, Dan Saleem, a sophomore majoring in political science and minoring in history. He's a GW Student Association senator and a private first class in the United States Army.
And on the right, Eyad Sleem, a senior majoring in international affairs with a concentration on the Middle East and minoring in political science. He is the director of cultural integrity of the Lebanese Student Association.
Now, we take it to Carter Ohline and our debaters Liz, Dan, and Eyad.
I'm Carter Ohline, your moderator for this debate. Let's get right into it. On Monday, Biden announced another $9 billion in student debt relief for 125,000 Americans. Is Biden's new proposal to forgive student debt relief constitutional?
Well, I'd say that while it may be constitutional, it may not be what our economy can sustain right now. We are talking about a deal that would further put our inflation levels much higher. And right now, we are in a mode of economic recovery. We're not able to give Americans something that they deserve. We're not able to give Americans relief right now because right now we've got to think about the country as a whole.
I would say that the student debt plan that he's offering now is much more narrower than the previous one that was struck down by the Supreme Court, especially because it's going after those who have spent the last 25 years paying off that loan, those who are from institutions where historically those loans took a long time to be paid off, and some of the most vulnerable Americans. But I think at this moment, student debt has ballooned past sort of the precipice of where we can really do action to resolve any and all of it. And at this moment, I think that now is better than never. I think that if we keep stalling these plans, we will never really see what real student debt forgiveness will do, which is allow individuals to go and pursue their lives as, economically sound Americans. I think at this moment, the narrower plan is actually safer for the economy than the previous plan. And I think it's more than necessary to go farther when it comes to student debt forgiveness because we are seeing so many Americans succumb to just wanting simple higher education, but having to pay a very lofty price for it. And I think that as we continue on, we must, really achieve student debt forgiveness, or else we're really going to sort of burden those who are trying to achieve higher education, where we're going to see those who are more wealthy, more elite, getting higher education compared to the rest of the American populace. And I think if we keep stalling on that, then individuals will stop seeking higher education. So I think now is better than never.
I understand that, but when we talk about being economically sound, you look at the gas prices right now, you look at inflation. If you were to give out those debt reliefs, how is that going to help people with the inflation in this country right now? My mother, she went to college. She went to college 25 years ago. She would benefit from this program, but still with the daily costs and the daily needs of gas, going to work, the higher prices in supermarkets right now, it would not make a difference at this point in our country.
So you're saying we do nothing?
I'm saying that we don't do it right now. Of course it's a good intention. Of course the Biden administration has good, gracious intentions when wanting to give debt relief, but right now is not the time to do it.
But if we just keep kicking it further and further and further down the road, we're never actually going to achieve anything. I think action is needed now, and of course inflation is an important thing to think about when we're doing these economic plans, but as you've seen previously, when we were forgiving student debt, that sort of rhetoric was only used to sort of continue kicking that objective down the road. And the more we delay it, the more we push it further back, is less likely for us to do anything about it. I think Biden is trying to make sure that students do not have a burden when it comes to achieving higher education. It is seen that higher education is an income surplus factor. So if we don't stop, kicking, if we stop kicking it down the road, we'll actually finally do some important legislative work in making sure that students feel comfortable and that students who did get a higher education degree can pay off their student loans, especially if they have been paying them off for 25 plus years, or if they come from institutions where there have been low outcomes when it comes to paying off those student loans. I mean, this helps some of the most vulnerable Americans, especially those on disability or those who are economically challenged. And it doesn't matter if you don't have the funds or if you declare bankruptcy, you will still have to pay that. So now, when we're looking at this, I think it's so important that we say, hey, let's resolve this, because even if times are tough, that shouldn't be weighing over Americans' heads, especially if you've been paying them off for 25 plus years, or if you're some of the most vulnerable Americans.
Well, if we're going with that logic,
do we want to, Eyad, do you want to chime in here and add anything?
Thank you. Please. I think another debt that's hanging over the heads of Americans is a $33 trillion one and counting and climbing that is facing our generation, our kids' generation, and our grandkids' generation. That's been expanded throughout the past 30 years of this country. I think Biden's debt plan specifically is unconstitutional, as the first one was. That's why it was ruled down by the courts. It was, quote, the biggest legislative power without constitutional authority used ever in the history of the United States. Section 4 of the 14th Amendment does not permit the executive, just with a stroke of a pen, to incur debt relief onto citizens. I agree it's not the best thing to have Americans in debt, but the people who chose to go in debt chose to go in debt. We have people that did not go to college for 4 years and incur debt and now are being forced to pay it through their taxes, which I don't think is frankly fair, because those people are genuinely part of the working class. This debt relief forgiveness is really bottom to the top wealth redistribution. And I don't think that's really fair if we're putting in mind the working Americans that we actually have in mind. This is helping out the people who already went to college, not the people who couldn't afford to go in the first place, or the people that didn't want to put themselves in debt to begin with. As I said, as I started, we have a $33 trillion debt and growing. I don't think we should be focused on forgiving any student loan debt. I think we should be focused on dealing with the debt that we have as a nation, $33 trillion and growing every day. And then when we deal with that, or when we make strides to deal with that, because we're still spending trillions of dollars today that we're going to have to deal with, then we're not going to get anywhere as a country. Fixing a small solution like a student debt relief is going to exacerbate our long-time problem of a default on our national debt that'll crash our dollar. Then we'll really be waiting on bread lines, and then our student debt won't really matter at that point.
I completely agree. I think when you talk about relieving student debt, it may not be unconstitutional in my eyes, but this should be a more collaborative process. President Biden should consult more people when creating this plan. So what I am saying is, let's go back to the drawing board and think of a more inclusive process to do this, if we are even deciding to do it.
I think it's really important to acknowledge, just to say to your point really quickly, that, if we keep focusing on student loan debt, then, bread lines up the wazoo. I think that's such a bleak way of looking at student loan forgiveness. I think as we stand today, people shouldn't be saying, because I suffered and I paid my student loans, I shouldn't have to pay yours. And I understand the middle class argument, but maybe we can restructure it so that the 2% are paying the bulk of that. But right now, because of an enormous amount of tax cuts from the Republican Congress, we are seeing those individuals pay a fraction of what they would have paid in taxes. That money could have been used to, let's say, forgive student loans. But again, as we said, the brunt of taxes is going on to the middle class, the poorest individuals in America. I think what's really important, as to your point, is to make sure that when we are considering these programs that, one, we have enough revenue, but we could get so much more revenue if we're taxing the 1, the 2, the 3% of America's most wealthiest. I think another important thing to acknowledge is that when we have debates around student loan forgiveness, we're often seeing a lot of people say, I paid my student loans, I'm not paying yours. Just because you suffer doesn't mean you should be aiding and abetting in others' suffering, especially when it comes to financial and economic woes, because those can really, really follow you. It can follow your children. It can follow many, many more generations. I think it's really important to understand that not only should we see more tax revenue from the 1% to make sure that we are being able to pay for this student loan forgiveness, but we should also be a little bit more compassionate. Less of, because I suffered, you suffer too. I think that's not really fair. I think what we should really aspire for is change. And
on that note, according to an article from the Washington Post, the new proposal focuses on delivering the debt relief to select groups of borrowers, including those who have been paying for 25 years or longer, that owe more money than they originally borrowed. Do you think that this targeted approach is effective in mitigating the student debt crisis? We'll start with you, Dan.
No, I don't think so, because I still stand by the fact that this needs to be a more collaborative process. This is too broad. This is too misunderstanding of our nation's population and demographic. If you are going to make a plan like this, you need to consult all the parties and you need to consult all the organizations that have a stake in this, even if we are doing this.
And I'm not against at all being compassionate. It's just people take the choice to come to college. I took the choice. You took the choice. We all took the choice here to come study at university. Some people took the choice to go to a 2-year school to learn how to be a tradesman, a plumber, an electrician. And some of them are making more money than we're going to be making, and that's their choice, and that they took a good choice. Some people are viewing the 4-year college degree as losing more and more worth for people. So it's not really worth it for more people to go to college these days. My question is, why do we have to force that tradesman that went to a 2-year school and didn't incur as much debt as someone who went to a 4-year school or more to pay for that person's degree when they chose to take it? And what are we saying to those people that are being forgiven of their debt, that, oh, you could just take out more debt in the future for any other thing and it may be forgiven as well? And it sets an example for future college students that, yeah, just go to college and it may be forgiven in the future as well. That sets up such a bad example for our future generations. I agree with you on your point that college costs have skyrocketed in the past 30 years, and I'm all for taxing our college endowments. These schools have trillion-dollar endowments that need to be taxed if we want to solve this problem. I don't think we should be taxing the top 1%, of course, but we also should be taxing these college endowments that have raised the prices because of kind of government regulation inefficiency that leads to inflation college prices. And the college are also raising their costs because we're giving out more and more aid throughout the government. So when it's a cycle of when we keep giving money and spending money, that goes back to our $33 trillion debt problem we're printing out of thin air that we're not even raising, then it gets into a cycle of more and more debt. It doesn't do anything just to temporarily relieve one person's or a couple of people's debt, and then the problem will be solved. It's a cultural problem that we need to solve by working on how we're structuring our choices to go to college after high school, how the colleges are raising their costs past inflationary prices, and they're not getting taxed at the end of the day. So.
And I want to add on, this is not the end-all, be-all to debt relief. We have things like the GI Bill, we have things like the ROTC program that give students relief, that aid them for small amount of work and participation and service to their country. It's not like, if this bill doesn't get through, if this proposal doesn't get passed, students don't have anywhere else to go. There are other options built into our current budget right now.
Now, I'm not saying that this is the end-all, be-all of student debt forgiveness. I think there are plenty of options. ROTC is a great example. However, there are some people who cannot enroll in that program, sadly, which is not fair, but again, there are limitations to everything. I think what's really hard to understand for me is that to forgive someone's student loan debt that they've had for 25 years and have been paying off is somehow encouraging poor monetary behavior. And I don't think that's true. I think people know how dire the situation is for them. I think people know and say, well, I guess I have to make sure I buy less groceries because I have to pay my student debt payment. I don't have enough money for this. A lot of these people have children. And the biggest, expense for adults is going to be your child costs, whether that is food, schooling, clothing, anything like that. I think one of the biggest important things to mention is that not only are we seeing these individuals say, hey, I need help, and I think what we need to say is, okay, instead of saying, well, that's not good behavior, you should have known better before you decided to go to college. And yeah, you should probably think through your financial decisions before you go to college. But we shouldn't punish people for seeking higher education when that is sort of the status quo for individuals. And yes, you can go into trade school and you can make a lot of money too. However, I think it's really important to know that because you go to college, you're more likely to earn more as an individual.
Would either of you like to respond before we move on to a different topic?
I mean, I'm going to say it again. We have a $33 trillion debt. Like every dollar, every cent that the Congress spends is on our backs, our generation and our children's backs. Other countries aren't borrowing our debt anymore. They're not buying our debt. They're selling our debt. The Fed is selling our debt. It's all going to come back to our backs, the American citizens. We have a $33 trillion debt. We should focus on that before we focus on any individual or group student loan debt relief that is a choice taken by that person. I don't think we're not consenting to $33 trillion of debt and $2 trillion being spent every year. It's insane to me that we're still having a conversation where we're going to forgive student debt relief for people who went to four-year schools, for, let's say, gender studies, and someone that went to a trade school for 2 years and is working as an electrician or a plumber, a miner or somewhere, is going to pay off that person's debt because they chose to go take a $80,000 a year degree for gender studies that they're not going to be able to pay off in the future.
On to something else. We've been on this for a while. On Wednesday, October 25th, there was another mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. We're going to ask some questions about that. Do you think the response to mass shootings like the one we saw in Lewiston and others over in the past have been sufficient? Why or not? Let's start with you, Liz.
I think that I would say that a majority sort of feel numb to that. It's been happening so often that there's no more shock and awe of how could this happen. It is become a normal facet of our daily life, which is quite tragic, I think, that such horrible incidences become just something in the background, sort of noise that we just say thoughts and prayers and move on. I think that when we are talking about mass shootings, and especially this one, in this case, we are seeing an individual who had a mental health episode in August, then be allowed to own a semi-automatic rifle and then kill 18 people in a rampage that only ended with him taking his own life. So I think at this point, the question is, what are the legislative action we can take? Because I'm very tired of this, let's not talk about politics in this time of mourning, because I think that at this rate, it's not, think of the survivors. I think it's, let's make sure there are no more survivors. Let's make sure that there are no more people who have experience with this tragic issue. And I think at this point, I have very little faith that Congress or the president is going to do anything effective on this issue of gun control, because I think at this rate, it's a dead issue ever since the Dickey Amendment and ever since the failing of the Pat Toomey Manchin bill, because it's clear that this Congress is not going to move on guns in any sort of important or legitimate way.
I completely agree. I completely agree with the sentiment that we are tired. We are tired of seeing this go on and on and on. And I'm also tired of seeing this be a partisan issue. I'm tired of seeing both sides attack the other and say, well, you don't care about dead kids in elementary schools. That's not the point. The point is that both people want to help. Both sides of the argument want to help. So we can make this a bipartisan issue by including both arguments that this is a mental health epidemic and this is also a gun control issue.
I think it's definitely a mental health epidemic. I think if you look at the shooter specifically, he was ex-military. He did have some mental health issues. He didn't trigger any yellow flag laws in Maine, which are on the books. So those are measures that are there already to stop people from committing these heinous acts and getting their hands on guns when they shouldn't get their hands on guns. But there was no legal way to stop this guy from owning a gun. He was ex-military. He knew how to work a gun. The problem I see is that we send our veterans to these wars overseas, and then they come back here, and then they end up on the streets, homeless, with mental health issues. I don't think banning guns is the answer. We have a Second Amendment for a reason. It's there. It's never going to go away. Every ban on guns that we've seen, New York, my state, California recently, have been ruled unconstitutional. It's just not going to happen. Yeah.
Should we take better care of our veterans? Of course. That is a conversation that's always on the table, but it's not something that relates to this. We are talking about an event where there was a former military member who committed this crime. But what happens when it's not? What do we do when this doesn't have anything to do with the military? How did this individual get through a loophole, get through a gun purchasing loophole to get a silencer? Because the first time he tried to get that silencer, he was denied. So how did he get it the second time he went and tried to do it?
Well, that's a great question. And I think Maine really is, I don't know the specifics of their yellow flag laws, but they have yellow flag laws on the books. It's not like it's a free-for-all and people go get guns off the streets. But to say that, oh, we shouldn't let this man get a gun because he has mental health issues, like, okay, but how are you judging that, number one? And then number two is like, what are we judging as mental health issues to be able to stop that man from getting a gun? My 4 favorite words in the Constitution are shall not be infringed in the Second Amendment. When we start infringing on people's rights because you want to declare that they have some type of issue that we need to deal with, sure, let's deal with the mental health issue, but that doesn't mean we ban guns for everyone. Like, it gets back to the problem where criminals are not going to follow any kinds of laws. Like, if you're going to commit a crime to begin with, which is shooting people and killing people, you're not going to be focused on a law that's going to stop you from getting a gun. At the end of the day, if you're a criminal, you don't care about the laws or what's going to stop you from getting a gun. You care about doing your heinous acts and getting your credit for it.
Let's take this to a different question. What specifically, Liz, do you think needs to be changed in America to prevent events like this from happening again?
Well, I'm just going to respond to what you said. He never served overseas. He was a decade-long Army Ranger. So he was never serving overseas. Actually, the big thing is his family even warned the police that he was having a mental health episode because he got new hearing aids, which amplifies some sort of audio, which made him think that he was hearing voices. Now, when we're talking about gun control, I think it's really important to acknowledge this. There can be restrictions on the ownership of guns. Just as you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, you can't own guns if you have shown to be dangerous to the other individuals around you. And that has been upheld both in the lower circuit court and the Connecticut Supreme Court. So when it comes to sort of reacting to that, I understand that a ban is unconstitutional, but I think red flag laws are very important, background checks, waiting period. I think right now we need better mental health care, of course, but also we need gun restrictions. Those do not exist on separate planes, they exist on the same one, and we can have both of them. But as we sit here today, the NRA as an organization has been rampant within these discussions. Not only have they been saying, so we shouldn't allow mental health, people with mental health issues to own guns.
Do either of you have a response to this before we move on to our last topic?
I just completely agree. I think if someone is at a danger of hurting themselves and others, the guns cannot be in their hands. You have to have some level of restraint, because if not, we're going to have full-out chaos and full-out harming of more people and more incidents like what sadly happened in Maine.
No, I 100% agree. Background checks are a common sense measure to take. I think when you start restricting individuals' access to firearms, then you're going to start restricting law-abiding citizens from owning firearms, not criminals, because as I said before, criminals will find a way to get a gun no matter what laws are on the books, because they're criminals. They do not care about the laws, and they will commit that crime. I don't think dangerous people should own a gun as well. But in my state of New York, for example, if you have a medical marijuana card, you're not going to be allowed to own a firearm. Why? Because that medical marijuana card symbolizes you have some sort of mental illness, but that's being treated by medical marijuana. That's like basically not severe or harmful to other people. Then why is that restricting your right to own a firearm?
So we're going to take it over to some rapid-fire other topics. Mike Johnson was elected Speaker of the House after 3 weeks of internal Republican turmoil and several attempted votes. What are your thoughts on this entire process, and what do you think this says about the state of the Republican Party? We'll start with you, Eyad.
Well, I'm very happy to be having Speaker MAGA Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. I think the show that we saw for the past 22 days that the Republicans in Congress were deciding over the Speaker was a very important civics lesson that we as Americans needed to have. It was the first time a Speaker was vacated in history, and it was a momentous occasion for Americans to watch on their TVs as it happened. It allowed the Republican Party to go into conference and deliberate among themselves, something that we see exclusively on the Republican side, actually. We don't see Democrats really having these internal struggles. They seem very united, very in one force, I guess, iron-fisted leadership they have to just go on everything as a united group. But Republicans, as we know, are more independent-minded in Congress. They tend to have various caucuses that they're a part of, and they're moderates, more establishment types, and more MAGA supporters, such as Matt Gaetz, who filed the motion to vacate.
Liz, do you have a response?
I think that Mike Johnson is sort of a radical in a nice suit who doesn't accost people in the halls of Congress like Jim Jordan. He is the more professional out of the more conservative members. Not only does he believe that Noah's Ark had dinosaurs on it, but he also believes that gay marriage is a sin and gay sex is darkness and doom incarnate. I think that he is just a polished version of Matt Gaetz or Jim Jordan with more severe views on people's personal life and privacy. Not only does he want to outlaw abortion altogether, but he blames the mass shootings in this nation on no-fault divorce laws and radical feminism of the 70s. I mean, clearly this individual has a hard relationship with reality. By hard, I mean non-existent. And so I think at this moment, he is the choice because no one knew who he was. Even members of the Senate said, I can't wait to get to know him. You don't know who the Speaker of the House is before he's elected? Are you kidding me?
That's a great thing, in my opinion. He's not someone that's owned by K Street and Wall Street. Like, he's an unknown deal in Republican politics and in Congress. He's not someone that's climbed the leadership ladder to become Speaker of the House. He was 7th in line in the Republican leadership, nowhere in contention. He's not someone has lobbyists come to his office every day like Kevin McCarthy used to, but he's not someone that's owned by K Street, and that's something, as someone who's a supporter of MAGA and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which is a great sign to see that we have someone fighting for the common everyday American, not his lobbyists and special interests that are funding him.
As well as the fact that he was also super important when it comes to the challenges. The challenges of the 2020 election, he was a key in Texas.
Yes.
I don't think that's a good thing to basically say, hey, everyone who voted, JK, we didn't like it, let's fix that. I think that he is an individual who is polished enough for the moderates, but just radical enough for those on the MAGA wing. And I think as an individual, not only does his lack of name recognition worry me, but his lack of ability to do anything in Congress. Only 6% of his bills have been ever heard on the floor. 6%. I mean, we have more active House members. I mean, you don't have to be owned by K Street to be an effective member of Congress, right? So
we could agree to disagree about that. I mean, it's very hard to pass legislation through Congress, especially if you're not supported by other legislators that are also owned by the same special interest.
Well, at least make a valiant effort than an individual who has, in every way possible, held some of the most unpopular views on Americans' private life. I mean, people agree wholeheartedly, 70% of Americans have no issue with same-sex marriage, no issue with gay sex, no issue with no-fault divorce laws. I mean, if you're going to blame mass shootings on no-fault divorce laws and radical feminism, not even bring up a good point like mental health, my question is, how can you lead one of the most important roles in Congress and have such a weird and wacky view on reality?
I don't think a religious view on reality is weird and wacky. Mike Johnson has his right to have his religious views, of course. I don't think that us characterizing his views as weird and wacky is really going to solve the problem of what we're going to get done in Congress. The man is Speaker of the House, whether you like it or not. He's not going to overturn Obergefell out of nowhere like some may think. Like, that's just not going to happen. Like, Mike Johnson was elected out of 9 Republicans that ran for Speaker. He was the one that had the most amount of his bills actually pass from those 9 that ran for Speaker. It's because the leading opposition candidate to the current resident of the White House is actually being politically persecuted and going to be stopped from running again, possibly, to face the current resident of the White House again, 2024, next November. We have people being locked up for years now because of a protest that happened at the Capitol. We have people, Douglas Mackey, locked up because he posted a meme during the 2016 election telling people to get out and vote on Wednesday, which is a time-old tale in politics to make a joke about getting out to vote on Wednesday, the day after Election Day.
It also shows the Democratic Party needs a rebrand. People are not understanding where they stand, what their policies are, and essentially what the future looks like, because too many people disagree and we're not having the debates that we should be having. This should not be personal. This should be, we're here now, how do we move on, and how do we make the future better?
Exactly.
That is all we have time for today. Liz, Eyad, Dan, thank you so much for being here with us today. Once again, I'm your moderator, Carter Ohline. Let's go back to the hosts for some fact check.
Eyad stated that schools have trillion-dollar endowments. This is not true, with the largest school endowment being $50 billion at Harvard, and for the 2022 fiscal year, the endowment market for colleges stood at $807.332 billion total.
He also mentioned that the implementation of yellow flag laws can allow for safer gun purchases, but in the case of Lewiston, those yellow flags were raised and the police were notified, but nothing was done.
Liz mentioned that GW tuition is upwards of $80,000. According to GW, the 2023 to 24 tuition is $64,700 per year. However, GW's cost of attendance is $85,740 for first years and $89,090 for upperclassmen. She also mentioned that you do not need a license to purchase a firearm. To clarify, a firearm license is needed to obtain a firearm, but a driver's license is not.
She also stated that 6% of Mike Johnson's bills made it to the floor. We couldn't find any evidence to confirm or deny this claim. In addition, she claimed that Johnson believed dinosaurs were on Noah's Ark. While this isn't inherently true, he did lobby for a Noah's Ark theme park, which had dinosaurs on the Ark.
We have confirmed that all other facts given are true.
Well, that's all for this episode of Capital Crossfire.
Be sure to check us out online at www.gw-tv.com and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at GW Capital Crossfire.
For all of us at GWTV, I'm Nina.
And I'm Nicholas.
Thanks for getting caught in the crossfire with us.
We'll see you back here next time.